All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time, we're looking at Hurricane Zephyr. The one, that massive storm that just hammered the Northeast. You probably caught some of the headlines and the initial coverage, of
Oh,
course.
yeah, definitely. It was hard to miss.
Right. And we actually got a bunch of requests from you guys to really dig into this one. So we're going to look at some of the news reports, some of the firsthand accounts, and try to put it all together, see what we can learn.
Yeah, it's one thing to see the images on the news, the damage and all that. But there's always so much more to the story, the human impact, the decisions made or not made. I think these deep dives give us a chance to really understand these events, not just witness them.
Exactly. And sometimes the most surprising stuff comes from those individual stories. Like later on, we'll talk about a guy named Zeta in D.C. and his experience. But first, let's go back to the beginning, where Zephyr first made landfall. Delaware. They got hit with a 22-foot storm surge. Can you believe that? 22 feet.
That's just, I mean, it's hard to even picture that much water.
I know, right? And that alone would have been devastating. But then you add 130-mile-per-hour winds on top of that. That's like an EF3 tornado.
Wow. Yeah, EF3. So that's, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, the enhanced Fujita scale, it ranks tornadoes from EF0 to EF5, with EF5 being the absolute worst, total destruction. So those 130-mile-per-hour winds hitting Delaware, that's serious force.
Absolutely. And you can just see it in the reports, the sheer devastation. I mean, homes just gone, reduced to rubble, whole communities just wiped out. Tragically, 104 lives were lost in Delaware alone.
Yeah, and it's so easy to get caught up in the numbers, But one thing that really stuck with me was this photo. It was a family just sifting through what was left of their home, just debris. And they were trying to salvage anything they could, anything at all. It really brings it home. These are real people, real lives.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, right? Like,
Yeah.
what could have been done differently? How do you even prepare for something of this magnitude?
Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? You can't control the weather, obviously, but understanding it, that's a start. Like, most people understand hurricane categories, category 1, 2, 3, and so on. But even a hurricane that's weakening, it's been downgraded, it can still cause incredible damage, especially inland. And that's exactly what we saw with Zephyr.
Right. And that actually brings us to Washington, D.C. You'd think the nation's capital would be pretty well prepared for a storm, right?
I mean, you'd hope so, but even they got hit pretty hard.
They did. And it's interesting because they took the precaution of evacuating the president and the entire White House staff. So you can imagine that scene, right? That scramble, that urgency.
And I can only imagine the chaos.
Right. But then, on the other hand, you've got this resident in D.C., a guy named Zeta, and he actually decided to stay put, right out the storm. He felt safe because the storm was weakening as it approached D.C., so he figured the worst was over.
Yeah, I can see that logic, I guess, thinking it was winding down.
Yeah. Right. But as we saw, Zephyr still had some fight left in it. More than 3 feet of water ended up flooding the streets of D.C. It's crazy. The whole city turned into, like, a lake.
Oh, wow, that's intense.
And get this, even the White House wasn't spared. Flooding on the first floor, damaging historical artifacts.
No way, really. The White House. That's wild.
I know, right? The White House.
Yeah.
The symbol of American power, and it's being infiltrated by floodwaters. It's a pretty powerful reminder that nature doesn't discriminate. Even the most powerful institutions are vulnerable to its wrath, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's a humbling thought for sure. Yeah, it really makes you think about how we understand these storms and the damage they can do. It's not just about the category. Even when a hurricane's weakening or it's been downgraded to a tropical depression, the rainfall, that sustained rainfall, that can be devastating.
Right, like Zeta, that resident we were talking about in D.C. It seems like he maybe underestimated the risk, even though the storm was technically weakening.
Yeah, it's a good example of how we sometimes, as individuals, we don't quite grasp the full picture. And that brings up some interesting questions about how we communicate risk during these events. How do we make sure people understand the lingering dangers, like flooding, even after the storm seems to have passed?
It's so important, right? We can't just rely on that simple category. People need to understand the full range of potential impacts. Storm surge, flooding, wind damage, all of it.
Exactly. And that information needs to be clear, easy to understand for everyone, no matter their background.
Absolutely. So while D.C. was dealing with all that flooding, Zephyr was moving north. It hit Pennsylvania next, still carrying a ton of moisture, even though it was weaker. And we saw some really scary situations there, like the mudslides reported in Harrisburg.
Oh, wow. Mudslides on top of flooding. That's just terrifying.
Could you imagine? You're dealing with the floodwaters, and then suddenly You've got mud and debris rushing down the hillsides, burying homes and businesses.
It's a nightmare scenario.
And then from Pennsylvania, Zephyr churned its way into the tri-state area. And this is where that relentless rainfall really came into play. Get this, 10 inches of rain in just 3 hours.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. That kind of rapid intensification, it's becoming more and more common with these storms. And it's a huge challenge for forecasting and preparation. I mean,
Yeah.
when you have that much rain in such a short period of time, flash flooding becomes a widespread threat almost immediately.
Exactly. And we saw the consequences all over the region. Submerged cars, flooded subway stations, people wading through waist-deep water.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly our urban environments can be overwhelmed.
Right. And it's not just the initial flooding either. We're talking about damage to infrastructure, disruptions to transportation.
The economic impacts can be huge, and those can linger for a long time.
Before we move on, I think it's important to just take a step back for a second. We've talked about individual stories, specific impacts in different places. But the sheer scale of this disaster, it's just mind-blowing. States of emergency declared across Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, D.C.
And tragically, 139 lives lost across the whole region. It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of these events, you know?
It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but each one of those 139 lives, it represents a person, a family, a community that's been shattered.
Absolutely. And as we shift from the immediate response to the long process of recovery, I think it's so important to highlight the resilience of the people affected by this.
Yes,
We've
definitely.
seen so many stories of communities coming together, neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers from all over offering support.
Yeah, it really is amazing to see, that kind of compassion and solidarity. It's like, even in the darkest times, there's this reminder that we're all human, that we're all in this together.
Right. It really shows the strength of the human spirit. But it also, I think, underscores the importance of being prepared as a community, building that resilience, not just reacting when disaster strikes, but taking steps beforehand to mitigate the risks, to be ready.
That's a good point. It's not enough to just react. We have to be proactive.
Mm,
And that kind of brings us to the big question, right? What can we learn from all this? What lessons can we take from Hurricane Zephyr so that we can be better prepared in the future? Because, let's face it, these extreme weather events, they're probably going to become more frequent, more intense as our climate continues to change.
yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. It's going to take a lot of effort on multiple fronts. Investing in infrastructure that can withstand these kinds of events, improving our early warning systems, making sure everyone has access to accurate information. But it also goes beyond that, I think.
What do you mean?
Well, it's about a shift in mindset, right? We can't be complacent anymore.
Right.
We have to acknowledge the reality of climate change and how it's affecting our weather.
Absolutely.
And each of us has to take responsibility, for preparing ourselves and our communities.
So it's not just about surviving the next storm. It's about learning to thrive,
And
even as the climate changes.
exactly. Adapting, innovating, finding ways to create a sustainable future.
And that's a message of hope, I think. We may not be able to control the weather, but we can control how we prepare, how we respond, how we build a more resilient future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Hurricane Zephyr, I hope you're leaving not only with a sense of the devastation, but also with a sense of, well, empowerment, maybe. We've got a lot of work to do, but we can do it. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Stay safe out there, stay informed, and stay engaged.